Gerald Allerton never imagined the nightmare hiding behind his own front door. His daughter Macy, once a bright and innocent teenager, was trapped in a web of lies spun by the three men he called brothers, his own uncles. What began as a quiet family secret would soon unravel into a chilling story of betrayal, control, and survival that shook their small town to its core. In the small, wind-worn town of Everdell, Nebraska, life moved slowly. Dust hung in the air from the gravel roads, and neighbors waved without knowing each other's names. Everyone knew everyone by face, if not by story. And among the familiar faces was the Allerton family, quiet, distant, and largely unbothered. Their home sat near the edge of town, isolated by tall pine trees and a wooden fence that had slowly darkened with age. It was a house with secrets, but no one dared to ask questions. Gerald Allerton, the father, worked long hours at a warehouse 30 miles outside town. A broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and deep frown lines, Gerald kept to himself, speaking only when necessary. After losing his wife to an aggressive form of cancer nearly a decade earlier, he focused solely on raising their only child, Macy, or so it seemed. After his wife's funeral, Gerald's three brothers Earl, Dennis, and Clay moved into the house to help out. It seemed understandable at first. He needed support, and they had always been close. Earl, the oldest of the three, had a controlling air about him, always watching with cold, calculating eyes. Dennis was quieter, more withdrawn, but present nonetheless. Clay, the youngest, often acted like the peacemaker, smiling more than the others, but never quite warmly. The town noticed how the house grew louder and darker after they arrived. Macy was only 10 when her mother passed. At first, she seemed like any other grieving child, quiet, pale, unwilling to speak much. But the change in her came slowly and deeply. At school, she was withdrawn. Teachers tried to reach her, but she avoided eye contact and rarely completed assignments. By the time she was 14, she had stopped attending school altogether. The official reason given was homeschooling, but no one ever saw her at the library, nor did she show up for standardized tests. Neighbors rarely saw Macy outside. If they did, it was usually in the backyard, hanging laundry with one of her uncles nearby. She walked with her head down, shoulders tense. Her clothes were plain, her hair unbrushed. People noticed, but no one intervened. The Allertons were just seen as private. Gerald was respected enough, and people assumed the uncles meant well. There were whispers, of course, about the odd arrangement, but in a small town, gossip was easy to dismiss. It wasn't just the girl's absence that drew attention, but the way the house seemed to exist in a different rhythm than the rest of the town. The curtains were always drawn. The yard was maintained, but never welcoming no toys, no garden, no signs of life beyond necessity. Occasionally, neighbors heard music late at night or saw flickering lights in the basement windows, but these moments passed quietly. Everdell was the kind of town where people minded their own business even when they shouldn't. Inside the Allerton house, time worked differently. Gerald, busy with night shifts and overtime, was often gone for long stretches. The uncles ran the household in his absence. They did the cooking, the cleaning, and whatever else needed doing. Gerald trusted them. They were family. He never thought to question their role in raising Macy. He assumed she was being schooled at home, fed, and cared for, and Macy never complained. She never reached out. Over the years, her world shrank. No phone, no internet access, no friends. Her uncles were her world, and as she grew into adolescence, their influence deepened. They spoke for her at doctor's appointments, managed her routines, and dictated her every move. From the outside, it appeared she was being looked after. But from within, she was being groomed, piece by piece. There were signs if anyone had looked closer. Macy's posture always stiff, her gaze always scanning. Her reactions to loud sounds delayed but intense. But in a town like Everdell, where familiarity passed for intimacy, no one asked questions they weren't ready to hear answers to. And the Allertons were, at best, considered an odd family. At worst, they were simply ignored. In time, Macy became a ghost in her own home. She drifted through rooms without making noise, always accompanied by one of the three uncles. She stopped speaking in full sentences. Her body language was the only way she communicated, shoulders tightening when someone walked too close, eyes darting toward exits when strangers entered the room. Still, there were no reports, no interventions. To the world, the Allerton family was private and harmless. Gerald, exhausted and emotionally distant, rarely looked beyond his daily routine. He thought Macy was growing into a quiet, obedient young woman. In his eyes, the house functioned, bills were paid. Meals were made, Macy was home. And the brothers, who had been there through his darkest hours, gave him no reason to doubt them. His trust, misplaced and unquestioned, became the very thing that allowed the nightmare to grow unchecked. No one knew it yet, but within the walls of that faded house on the edge of town, a disturbing world had been carefully built. And it had existed, unnoticed and undisturbed, for nearly a decade. What the town would eventually learn too late was that evil doesn't always come kicking down the door. Sometimes it's invited in. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. And sometimes it hides behind a smile, waiting. It was an unusually stormy evening in late September when Gerald Allerton's routine was disrupted. The power had gone out at the warehouse where he worked nights, forcing the manager to send the crew home early. Gerald wasn't one to welcome surprises. He preferred the predictability of work, the long hours that kept his mind from wandering. As he drove back toward Everdell, the rain poured steadily, drumming against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. He hadn't called ahead. There was no need. He expected to return to a dark, quiet house, perhaps with Macy already asleep and his brothers playing cards or watching television. That was the image he carried in his mind, the version of home he trusted. As he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. A dim orange glow spilled from the basement window, a flickering light that didn't match the rest of the house. The upstairs was dark, just as he had expected. But the basement, where no one usually spent time, was alive with activity. He paused in the driveway longer than usual, squinting through the rain. Then, with tired curiosity, he stepped out of the car and made his way to the front door. Inside, the air was strangely warm, thick with a smell he couldn't place something sweet, artificial, and cloying. He set down his work bag, removed his boots, and stood still. The silence was unsettling. No sounds of television, no footsteps. Just the faint hum of something electrical coming from beneath the floorboards. He moved toward the basement door and noticed it wasn't locked, a detail that would seem small later. But in that moment it stood out like a whisper in a crowded room. He descended the steps slowly, one hand brushing the wall, the other gripping the railing. With each step, the hum grew louder. At the bottom, the basement stretched out into a dimly lit space filled with old furniture, mismatched rugs, and stacks of unlabeled boxes. A small TV on the far table cast a soft flickering light. But it wasn't the television that drew Gerald's attention. It was the filing cabinet in the corner, its drawer hanging open, folders scattered across the floor. A strange compulsion pulled him forward. He knelt beside the mess and picked up the first folder. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Some were recent, others clearly years old. All featured Macy. Some showed her sitting, staring blankly at the camera. Others were more disturbing, posed, and uncomfortable. Gerald's hands trembled as he flipped through them. At first he told himself they were innocent, awkward family pictures, but that illusion shattered quickly. The expressions, the settings, the intimacy, they told a different story, a much darker one. Beside the folders was a box filled with videotapes and old digital camcorders. Gerald pressed play on the nearest device, unable to stop himself. What he saw made him drop it immediately. The footage was grainy, but the people were unmistakable. Macy, Earl, Dennis, Clay, the context needed no explanation. The sounds, the visuals, the way she didn't speak, it all painted a reality that Gerald couldn't comprehend. His stomach turned. His breath caught in his throat. He backed away from the tapes, stumbled to his feet, and turned toward the shelves. There were journals, labeled and dated. He opened one belonging to Earl and read quickly, skimming entries filled with justification. Rationalizations, twisted declarations about love and purity. Each word was more horrifying than the last. The entries referenced rituals, lessons, and obedience. It was a system, carefully built and maintained. It wasn't just abuse, it was indoctrination. A carefully maintained illusion crafted by the three men he had trusted with his daughter. Gerald left the basement in a daze. His ears rang. His body felt like it was no longer his own. Upstairs, he saw Macy's bedroom door ajar. He peered inside. It was empty. The room was sparse with no personal touches, no decorations. Just a mattress, a dresser, and one small lamp. Everything about the space was sterile, controlled. It didn't look like a teenager's room, it looked like a holding cell. In the kitchen, he found Clay sipping coffee. When Clay saw Gerald's face, something shifted. He opened his mouth to speak, but Gerald walked past him without a word. He left the house, got into his car, and drove straight to the Everdell Police Department. The officers on duty listened to Gerald's account with visible shock. They followed him back to the house within the hour, bringing backup, cameras, and search warrants. What they found confirmed every horror Gerald had described. Dozens of tapes, hundreds of photographs, detailed journals, even hidden compartments built into the basement walls containing items too disturbing to describe. All three uncles were arrested on the spot. Macy was taken into protective custody. News of the arrest spread through town by morning. The Allerton home, once invisible behind its fence, was now the center of a nightmare that no one could look away from. The community was shaken. The family they had ignored for so long had been hiding something monstrous in plain sight. And at the heart of it all was a girl who had never once cried for help, not because she didn't want to, but because she had never been allowed to believe help existed. In the days following the arrests, investigators began to peel back the layers of what had happened inside the Allerton home. What they uncovered was not a case of sudden madness or impulsive crime, but a carefully constructed world of psychological control that had been years in the making. The evidence told a story more chilling than anyone in Everdell could have imagined, a story not of violence in the traditional sense, but of slow, deliberate erosion of a young girl's autonomy, orchestrated by the very people who were meant to protect her. Macy Allerton had been groomed. Not in the casual, misused sense of the word, but in the truest, darkest form. It began when she was barely 10 years old, just after her mother's death. That loss had left a hole in her life, one that needed love, stability, and reassurance. Instead, she was surrounded by 3 adult men who saw vulnerability not as something to protect, but as something to exploit. Earl, Dennis, and Clay each played a distinct role in her manipulation. They weren't reckless or erratic, they were methodical. Earl, the oldest, operated like a cult leader. He used language drawn from books and twisted philosophies, convincing Macy that their bond was sacred. He told her the outside world was filled with evil, that people wouldn't understand what they had. His journal entries, recovered by police, were filled with pages of circular reasoning, false justifications, and strange, religious-like metaphors that framed Macy's submission as something holy. Earl wasn't just trying to hide what he was doing, he was building a belief system to justify it. Dennis, by contrast, was more calculating and quiet. He wasn't the face of the operation, but he was the enforcer. Investigators discovered that he handled most of the logistics, surveillance, restricting access to phones, installing locks, disabling the Wi-Fi. He monitored Macy's movements, decided when she could go outside, and even kept a log of her behavior in a notebook. His method was control through structure and through fear. While Earl fed Macy delusions of love, Dennis reminded her of the consequences of disobedience. Clay's role was the most deceptive. He positioned himself as the comforter, the kind one, the safe uncle. He often brought Macy small gifts, allowed her slightly more freedom within the house, and even took her on short drives, always under the guise of trust. But that trust was weaponized. By creating contrast between himself and the others, Clay kept Macy confused, emotionally dependent. It was a classic tactic used in manipulation: hurt, then heal. Take away freedom, then return a piece of it to make the victim feel grateful. He made her think he was the only one on her side even, though he was just as involved in the abuse. The 3 of them didn't just control Macy's physical environment, they controlled her mind. They created a schedule for her: when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. They told her the outside world was dangerous, that people wouldn't understand her, and that she would be taken away if she ever told anyone. The fear became her prison. She didn't know what was real anymore. She stopped asking questions. She stopped believing there were answers. One of the most disturbing elements of the investigation was the discovery of the training logs, notebooks kept by Earl and Dennis that documented Macy's behavior in cold, detached language. Each entry noted her obedience, her resistance, her responses to certain triggers. It was as if they saw her not as a person, but as a subject, something to be conditioned. The logs read like scientific experiments, with phrases like improved compliance and emotional regression noted. Investigators were stunned by the level of detail. It wasn't spontaneous abuse, it was calculated, ritualized. The home itself was another layer of the prison. Investigators found hidden cameras in several rooms, all linked to a closed-circuit system in the basement. Macy's bedroom door had a lock on the outside. The windows were sealed shut. Even her clothing was controlled, chosen each morning by her uncles. She owned no devices, no books, no personal journals. Her world was stripped down to a routine that left no room for rebellion. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a pre-recorded set of lessons Earl had made her watch on an old tablet. These videos were designed to reinforce the rules of their world, phrases repeated again and again like chants. We are family, we are love, outsiders are enemies, silence is safety. Over time, Macy had internalized these messages. She didn't just live under their control, she believed in it. That was the most tragic part. When Macy was finally taken into custody by Child Protection Services, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She was quiet, still, compliant. She didn't understand what was happening, not in the way the officers did. For her, the world she had lived in wasn't a nightmare, it was normal. That illusion would take months, even years, to undo. As the investigation expanded, it became clear this wasn't just a case of familial betrayal, it was a full-scale psychological operation. Experts brought in by the state described it as one of the most complete systems of coercive control they had ever encountered. It blurred the line between captivity and dependency, between fear and loyalty. Macy's trust had been shattered not by strangers, but by those whose protection she should have been able to count on without question. And all of it had happened quietly, inside a house with curtains drawn, on a street where people waved but never knocked. When the Allerton case went to trial, it quickly became one of the most shocking and talked about legal battles in the state's history. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, lawyers, and locals from Everdell who struggled to understand how a family could fall so far into darkness. The evidence was overwhelming, but the defense team was determined to challenge every piece, pushing back with arguments about consent and family loyalty. What made the trial so gripping wasn't just the horror of the crimes, but the disturbing way the defense tried to rewrite the story, forcing the public to confront uncomfortable questions about power, control, and responsibility. The prosecution presented a carefully constructed case. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of events, detailing the years of grooming and manipulation that had led to Macy's captivity. They introduced the photographs, videos, journals, and surveillance footage as proof of the uncle's deliberate and repeated abuse. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological effects of coercive control, explaining how victims like Macy often appear compliant, even consenting, because of the intense fear and conditioning they experience. The jury heard about the locked doors, the hidden cameras, and the strict rules imposed on Macy from a young age. They learned how each uncle played a distinct role in maintaining the cycle of abuse. One of the most haunting moments in court was when Macy's therapist testified. She described Macy's struggle to break free from years of psychological manipulation, explaining that the trauma was not just physical but deeply emotional and mental. The therapist painted a picture of a young woman trapped in a web of lies and fear, unable to trust anyone, even after she was removed from the house. It was a powerful reminder that freedom from such abuse was not as simple as walking out the door. The defense team, however, worked hard to muddy the waters. They argued that Macy was an adult by the time the abuse was fully exposed and claimed she had given consent to the relationships with her uncles. They called character witnesses to paint a picture of the Allerton family as close-knit and loving. They questioned the reliability of Macy's testimony and suggested that the evidence was exaggerated or misinterpreted. Their goal was clear: to create doubt, to shift blame, and to cast the victims as willing participants rather than prey. But the prosecution was prepared. They countered every claim with facts, expert testimony, and the overwhelming physical evidence found in the Allerton home. The detailed journals, full of twisted plans and instructions, could not be dismissed as mere fantasy. The surveillance footage showed Macy's controlled environment. The psychological experts made clear that consent under coercion was not true consent. Slowly, the defense's arguments lost ground. One of the biggest surprises of the trial came from a whistleblower within the local police department. An officer who had initially been skeptical of Gerald S. claims shared new information. The uncles had been under investigation years earlier for unrelated charges but had escaped scrutiny because no one had looked deeply enough. This revelation cast doubt on the idea that the abuse was a secret kept only within the family. It suggested that others had been close to uncovering the truth but had looked away. The jury deliberated for days. The tension was palpable. For the people of Everdell, the case wasn't just about legal guilt, it was about reckoning with a nightmare in their own backyard. When the verdict was finally read, all three uncles were found guilty on multiple counts of sexual abuse, coercion, and kidnapping. The judge sentenced each to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, emphasizing the severity and cruelty of their crimes. Macy's story did not end with the verdict. After the trial, she was placed under state protection, moving into a secure facility where she could begin the slow process of healing. Medical professionals and counselors worked tirelessly to help her regain a sense of safety and autonomy. It was a painstaking journey, filled with setbacks and moments of despair. But Macy showed resilience, a quiet strength that surprised even those closest to her. The community of Everdell also had to come to terms with the aftermath. Many felt guilt for not noticing sooner or for ignoring the signs. Local organizations and social services launched initiatives aimed at preventing similar abuses, raising awareness about grooming and coercive control. Schools introduced programs to teach children about boundaries and personal safety. The Allerton case became a painful but important lesson in vigilance and responsibility. The house itself, the physical symbol of the nightmare, became a subject of debate. Some wanted it torn down immediately, fearing that its presence would haunt the town forever. Others saw it as evidence, a place that should remain untouched for as long as possible. Ultimately, the decision was made to demolish the home quietly, erasing the physical reminder but not the memory of what had occurred. For Gerald, the trial was a shattering experience. He faced public scrutiny and private torment, grappling with his own feelings of failure and betrayal. His trust in family had been destroyed, replaced by a painful understanding of how deception and evil can hide behind familiar faces. Though estranged from the uncles, he vowed to protect Macy at all costs, dedicating himself to supporting her recovery. The Allerton trial remains a landmark case in criminal law, not because of the violence, but because of the slow, unseen way abuse can take hold. It forced the public and the justice system to confront the uncomfortable truth that trauma can be hidden in plain sight, masked by love, family, and silence. For Macy and the town of Everdell, it was a tragic lesson that some of the worst crimes happen not in dark alleys but behind closed doors. In the years following the trial, the story of Macy Allerton became a symbol of both the devastating consequences of abuse and the slow, fragile process of healing. For a long time, Everdell struggled to move past the horror that had unfolded within the town's borders. The scars left behind were not only on Macy and her family, but on the community itself. People who had once lived comfortably in ignorance now wrestled with guilt, shame, and a deep need for understanding. The questions lingered. How had no one seen? How had they looked the other way? And more importantly, how could something like this be prevented from happening again? Macy's recovery was neither quick nor linear. When she first entered the care system, she was a quiet shadow of herself. She rarely spoke, often staring out windows or retreating into silence for hours. The therapists who worked with her faced an enormous challenge. Years of manipulation had fractured her trust in others, especially in men. Her relationship with her father was tentative. Gerald struggled to connect with his daughter, wanting to be her protector but unsure how to break through the walls built by trauma. It took time, months, then years of consistent support and care to see real progress. Small milestones became monumental victories. The first time Macy smiled genuinely. The first time she spent an afternoon with a friend outside the system. The first time she told her own story without breaking down. These moments were quietly celebrated by those around her. Her recovery was a testament to human resilience, but also a reminder of how much damage abuse can inflict. She carried scars that would never fully disappear, shadows that might never be completely banished. In the broader community, efforts to heal came in many forms. Everdell schools introduced mandatory education on recognizing and reporting abuse. Community centers hosted workshops on mental health and trauma-informed care. Local law enforcement underwent training to better identify signs of coercion and grooming, focusing on prevention as much as response. These changes were born from the painful lessons of the Allerton case and represented a commitment to never let silence or fear protect abusers again. The case also sparked wider conversations about the nature of family and trust. Many people in Everdell realized how deeply complicated family dynamics can be, how love and harm can sometimes exist in the same space. The town struggled to redefine what safety meant, not just physical safety, but emotional and psychological security. People became more vigilant, more willing to question the quiet lives behind closed doors. Years later, Macy chose to speak publicly about her experience, not in graphic detail, but in terms of survival and hope. She became an advocate for victims of abuse, working with organizations dedicated to helping others escape cycles of control. Her voice carried weight precisely because it came from someone who had lived through the darkest realities and emerged determined to rebuild her life. She reminded others that healing was possible, even after unimaginable trauma. Yet, even with progress, there were challenges. Macy faced ongoing battles with anxiety, trust, and the trauma that lingered beneath the surface. She worked hard to reclaim her identity beyond the victim narrative. Education became a key focus. She enrolled in community college, determined to build a future defined by her own choices. The path was difficult, but with support, she carved out a space where she could grow beyond her past. Gerald, too, found a new purpose. The pain of his uncle's betrayal never fully left him, but he channeled his grief into helping other families affected by abuse. He volunteered with local organizations, sharing his story in hopes of preventing others from experiencing what he had. His relationship with Macy, once strained and uncertain, slowly strengthened as they both navigated the long road to healing. The house on Pine Street, once the center of unspeakable pain, was gone. In its place was an empty lot, a silent reminder of a nightmare erased. Occasionally, new families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The town chose not to forget, however. A memorial plaque was installed in the town square, dedicated to survivors of abuse and those who worked to protect them. It served as a reminder that vigilance and compassion were essential weapons against darkness. As the years passed, the Allerton story became part of Everdell's collective memory, a cautionary tale and a source of hope. It forced the town to confront the uncomfortable truths about silence and denial, but also showed the power of community, resilience, and justice. The scars would remain, but so would the lessons learned. Macy's journey from captivity to advocacy, from silence to voice, became a beacon for others trapped in similar situations. Her story was told not just as a crime, but as a testament to the strength of the human spirit to endure, to fight, and to reclaim life after trauma. It was a story that demanded attention, compassion, and action. In the end, the tragedy of the Allerton family was more than a hidden crime. It was a painful awakening. It revealed how darkness can grow quietly, masked by normalcy and trust, and how the bravest act is to break that silence. For Macy and Everdell alike, the future held no promises of forgetting, but it did hold the promise of healing, and with healing, the possibility of hope.